Welcome, everyone. We'll give everybody just a moment to sign on and get situated, and then we'll get started.
Here we go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Chelsea Lake, and I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore. And I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Thank you for joining us in this virtual format in the midst of these extraordinary times, throughout all of which we strive to bring you the authors and books we all love to our Politics and Prose community. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be putting in the chat momentarily to purchase the 19th Hijacker on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask our author a question by clicking on Q&A, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but we apologize in advance if we don't get to address yours. We are also delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access the captions, click on Live Transcript. Look for the CC image at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we want to thank you again for joining us. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. James Reston Jr. is the author of 18 books, 2 of which are novels. He taught fiction writing in the creative writing program at the University of North Carolina for 10 years. Among his books are 3 works that deal with the clash of Christianity and Islam in history: Warriors of God, Dogs of God, and Defenders of the Faith. Warriors of God is an international bestseller that has been translated into 13 languages. The author was trained in the recruitment of foreign agents in Army intelligence during the Vietnam War era. Reston will be in conversation with Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, the Haldun Chair in Islamic Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming them both to PNP Live. Gentlemen.
Great.
Thank you, Chelsea. Dr. Professor James Reston Jr., wonderful to be with you again.
My pleasure.
My first statement is to point out that we are here to discuss your latest book, The 19th Hijacker. We're all waiting for the next one on Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor, but more of that later. So welcome to this session, this very special session. And you've already been introduced, Jim, but I do want to say that reading your bio and knowing about your background is really a bit like seeing an echo of Indiana Jones. You've been a professor, you're out in the field, you're writing books on the go, and I don't know how you do it because you're writing serious books, you're writing novels, and anyone who reads this book will really know that you are a poet at heart, a humanist, because just the approach that you have for this book, and that's my first question, the protagonist, the leading man, as it were, of the book is Sami Haddad. And what made you think of an Arab as a hero, one of the 19th hijackers? And I don't mean hero in the traditional sense, but he's the protagonist. What made you think of him as the leading character? And how did you manage to get under his skin? I mean, would have been a challenging task for you, considering he's one of the 19 who actually was involved in plotting and planning to assault America.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's such a pleasure to have this conversation with you about this book. As Chelsea mentioned, I had done 3 books of history that focused on the clash of Christianity and Islam. And the most successful took place, was published right before 9/11, actually, called Warriors of God. And it was, I like to think of a classic study of the clash between crusades and jihad, crusade and jihad. And I think the reason that was so successful was that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, America was just so shocked by this attack and really didn't as a collective body, know that much about the Middle East. So fast forwarding to 2010, I think I was on the outlook 10 years ago for a study where I could use that history, that work on the history on this issue in the present day. And I was at that time a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington, whose president then was Lee Hamilton. Lee Hamilton was a distinguished former member of Congress for 35 years, a great expert in national security matters. And simultaneously, he was also the co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. It stands with the Warren Commission after the JFK assassination as one of the great presidential commissions of recent American history. Anyway, he was talking about his work, and he somehow the conversation got to the question of the perpetrators, and he said there was one in particular that interested the commissioners, and that was the pilot, the terrorist pilot who took the plane down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. He was interesting to the commission for two reasons. One is that he was Lebanese, not Saudi Arabian or not from the Emirates, and came from a very fine middle-class family in Beirut, then went on to his higher education in Hamburg, Germany. The second reason that it really captivated the commissioners was that this character almost pulled out of the 9/11 attack 1 month before it happened. And he almost did so for the love of a woman in Germany, a Turkish-German woman. This, of course, interested me immediately as a storyteller.
Well, Jim, I find this fascinating because I've always suspected you're a romantic at heart. And I do want to ask you what happened to Karima in the end, you know, what happens to her as it were post your novel. But going back a little bit, what is it about Sami that interested you? Because he is such an interesting character. He's pulled in so many directions. He's a bit weak. He's not completely convinced of Osama bin Laden's jihad or his vision of attacking the United States. Yet he goes along. He doesn't like Atta, the one of the hijackers, one of the leaders of the gang of terrorists. So what is it that fascinates you about this individual?
Well, I felt at the time and feel today that the story of 9/11, a event that absolutely changed American history, had only really been half told, particularly on the question of Flight 93, that's the center of this novel. Because the lore of Flight 93 for Americans is this tale of extraordinary courage in the attack on the hijacker pilots and that eventuated in the plane going down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And that has been an almost epic story of American heroism, and also almost exclusively the focus of the story of Flight 93. It meant that the other side of it, the side of the perpetrators, was almost entirely unknown. I have been to Shanksville on a number of occasions, and I always imagined a 9-year-old boy with his father going to that national monument and looking up at his father and saying, well, why did these people do this? And there really is not an answer at the National Monument for Shanksville to that question, nor is there an answer in the literature, the American literature certainly, on Flight 93. The secondary thing about my interest was that, as Chelsea mentioned, I had been trained during the Vietnam War in Army intelligence in the recruitment of foreign agents. And it very much interested me to try to apply that training from Army intelligence to the question of an Islamic terrorist. What was it that would have drawn these people, particularly the small group of very skillful terrorists? What would have drawn young men of real intelligence into that circle? That fascinated me, and with the knowledge that I had from those other three books about Islamic history and Islamic theology, I wanted to see if I couldn't tap those resources to understand the recruitment of Sami Haddad.
Did you feel that by depicting Sami Haddad in a, I wouldn't say in a very sympathetic light, but in a depiction of reality that approximated to what you think would have happened based on the information you had in your research, that you were risking the wrath or the anger of the average American, because there's a kind of cultural mythology around 9/11, and there's a kind of narrative that has been more or less accepted in the mainstream. Did you feel that you were risking facing that backlash in your depiction of Sami Haddad?
I can honestly say I never worried about risk in doing it. I was absolutely captivated by the challenge of drawing a character who was involved in this horrendous event, but who was very much in conflict. If somebody had suggested to me that I do a book about Muhammad Atta, I would have been totally disinterested in that, because there is nothing to work with there. The Muhammad Atta, the leader of the 9/11 attack in America, is absolutely a flat line. There's no place to go with that. But I very much wanted to portray a character who was pulled between two very strong forces. One was he was drawn in, as you say, somewhat weakly, somewhat with some doubts about the whole thing, but drawn nonetheless, and got as far as he did get, but was in that last month torn between his commitment to Al-Qaeda and his commitment to this lovely woman in Germany. You did mention the research that I had done. I think I have come to believe, since this is a historical novel, that every self-respecting historical novel must do every bit of nonfiction research that he or she possibly can do before launching into the realm of imagination. And so I went to Beirut. I talked to the uncle of the real hijacker, who happened to be a very distinguished gentleman who was in the legislature of Lebanon. And I went to Hamburg and was very much helped by some lawyers there who had been involved in legal proceedings of the remaining Al-Qaeda people in Germany. So one has to do that basic research, every bit of research that you can, before you take that big step into the realm of imagination.
And Jim, many people in the audience thinking of taking the book, buying the book, The 19th Hijacker, which you are discussing with me, what would they know of what you added to the knowledge we have of this particular episode in our history? What is it that is new? What is it that is in addition to the writing of all the scholars and the journalists? After 9/11, as you know, there was a flood of books, and it still continues. So where is Jim Reston in this narrative?
Well, I'm hoping you're going to answer that question as well, because you have a better knowledge overall of the literature on all of this. But I think it goes back to what I just said, that there was only so far that one could go about what was the motivation of the 19 perpetrators, because they're all gone. And also because, and this was critical to my decision to write this as a novel as opposed to a nonfiction book, that all the information in the archives of the 9/11 Commission remain classified because there are ongoing legal proceedings in Guantanamo Bay, and that throws a blanket of classification over all the actual facts. That said, I doubt very seriously that what's in the files of the 9/11 Commission on the perpetrators is very valuable from a literary standpoint, if you will. That they were dead, their families either weren't talking to people or they were totally in denial. It would have been a swamp to try to sort out any sort of realistic nonfiction portrait of these men, particularly the most interesting of them that I've portrayed here. So yeah, I think that's where it's different. That I came up to the wall that I think virtually 100% of those books that you mentioned faced, and then decided to climb over the wall into imagination.
And what is the bottom line in terms of the question that you raised a bit earlier, and President Bush most famously asked, why do they hate us? What conclusion do you come to in this book?
Well, I'm not a very good person to answer that question, to be frank. I think when you're a novelist, you focus like a laser beam on the characters that you're trying to portray. That whatever in the end a reader takes from that portrayal about that big question is sort of beyond my purview. It strikes me back to the question you asked earlier that I didn't answer about the risk of a so-called sympathetic portrait. This, as you say, is not in any way a sympathetic portrait, but where my starting point was in all of this is that the American people had and do portray certainly the villains of 9/11 as monsters. And no good writer generally, and especially no good novelist, can start with the notion that his main character is a monster, because then there is no place to go with that story. So I very much wanted to have an open palette at the beginning, and to try to address these questions that we've been talking about, to fill in a picture. It may be totally different from who that actual terrorist was, but it allowed me to explore in a fictional way certain issues that one couldn't really have explored in nonfiction.
I think that is the strength, Jim, of your book. And as you know, the dangers of when you depict these criminals as monsters, as mechanical creatures, not human, then the next step is you brand the entire community. As you know, many people began to simply say Muslim equals terrorist and so on, and that hasn't completely disappeared, and it's caused a lot of anguish and despair in the community. So I think it's very important that we are conscious of that. And this leads me, Jim, to a big picture question for you. 9/11 happens, a great tragedy, very regrettable. And then we have its impact on the Muslim world and its impact on the United States. Can you very briefly comment on these two different trajectories? The impact on the United States, the impact on the Muslim world, and where we are now?
Yes. Again, I'm not really sure that I'm the best one to to answer that question. We've been somewhat distracted by the January 6th event, and America is very much focused at the moment on domestic terrorism, but the situation has not in any way changed. So, so I think this is almost an eternal.
Hi, everyone. Looks like we lost James. I'm sure he's going to hop back on. I apologize for the Zoom technical difficulties, but I am sure he's trying to log back on. And thank
And he
you.
has a whiz kid helping him, Chelsea.
He has a whiz kid helping him. We could hear something going on, so maybe he just had a little issue, and we'll be right back on. I'm going to see if I can, behind the scenes, help him out. I will be back if we don't get him.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Can you hear me now?
James,
Yes,
we
Jim.
can hear you. We can hear you.
It's like it's Houston. We have a problem here. So, but I think we're back now.
You're back, Jim. You're back. Well done.
Hold on, we're just fortunately I have a good technician here. Okay, you want to slip by? Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah.
So Jim, we were considering this question asked across the United States and continue to be asked. Why do they hate us? What President Bush had asked. And what conclusion do you come to after writing this book? Where do you fall on this, one side or the other, or what is your opinion?
Well, of course, 9/11 was a horrendous and shocking event. And I think, as you have rightly pointed out, it alone established this tremendous antipathy towards the Middle East and Arabs and Muslims in general. I know you probably personally have faced this question all the time, that people make judgments about people collectively because of one criminal act. And that, of course, is very unfair, but one might say it's somewhat human. I rather agree with you that I don't think that antipathy has withered away much. And of course, we've had COVID, folded on top of all of this. So, so I think when the world comes back to being normal, if in fact it's the case that Biden is going to shift attention away from the Middle East to China and Russia and so forth, it may be offer the Middle East somewhat of a breathing room and also somewhat dissipate this instinct towards hatred?
Well, I think it's so interesting, Jem, in terms of your own writing, in terms of your own interests as a scholar, as an intellectual, that the President Biden, has just announced final withdrawal from Afghanistan. But Afghanistan, as you know from reading of its history, is a land full of surprises. So right now, this is the schedule, this is the program. We'll see what happens in September. But even if American troops come back fully, finally, don't forget that while we're looking at China, China, in fact, is now in Central Asia and in the Middle East. As you know, it's very active there. So there's really no getting away from that region. And I hope that we've learned some lessons from this 20-year adventure or misadventure, if you like, in Afghanistan. What would you say are the main lessons that we have learned from our 20-year war in Afghanistan, the longest war we fought?
Let me just focus on September 11th itself, the coming September 11th. I think that's quite an interesting decision by President Biden to choose that symbolic date as the absolute end for American involvement in Afghanistan. One would think if you were only talking about half the story, that is to say the end of the longest war in American history, it would be a moment of great celebration. I mean, it might be equivalent to the end of World War II, or more appropriately, the end of the Korean conflict, so that there would be parades down Pennsylvania Avenue and there would be great flag waving and so forth. The fact that September 11th is also, and probably much more importantly, associated in the American mind with the death of over 3,000 Americans in this horrendous attack, makes it both a positive and a negative association. So my guess is that there might be a very quick celebration, if it's even called a celebration, to mark the end of this long protracted experience, but quickly be over, and because of the negative and the emotional side of 9/11.
Well, Jim, as you know, a lot of historians are comparing this episode, and especially the coming back, and we must give full marks to President Biden for his courage and wisdom in taking this decision. It's a very brave decision considering the public opinion and so on. But a lot of historians are comparing this to the first Anglo-Afghan War, which ended in disaster for the English troops, the Grand Army of the Indus, but then led directly to the second Afghan War, the Anglo-Afghan War. So as I said, that region is traditionally turbulent, and we have to watch it very, very carefully and really define our objectives. What exactly do we want there? Because for the kind of investment we make, young men and women dying there, the trillions of dollars spent there, what are we getting out of it? These are great questions. They're not directly related to your book, but I thought since we are discussing the themes from your book that they may be relevant to some of your general thinking. Now, I know...
if I may say
Yeah.
The fact that even in the press, the American press now, a major theme of the withdrawal from Afghanistan raises again this notion that the reason we did this for 20 years was to make sure that Afghanistan didn't be the haven for another attack on America. I think that that notion has been flawed from the very beginning. The notion that America had to occupy all of Afghanistan in order to make it safe from terrorist attack. And this keeps coming up as it's being reported about the end of this notion on September the 11th, that the reason we're you know, we were there for the 20 years was to protect ourselves from another attack. So things have greatly changed in the Middle East. You know this far better than me. Things have greatly changed. We read in the country of Afghanistan, and we'll have to see how it works out. But even in the press, those who are criticizing Biden are saying, well, we hope that he's not made a big mistake and that American troops are going to again be drawn back into Afghanistan. This has to be the end of it, regardless of what happens.
Well, Jim, all I can say is that President Biden and his team would benefit from reading your books because it gives them an insight, a different dimension in looking at this problem, which is so familiar to us. Now, Jim, you were going to read an excerpt from the book where Sami meets Osama bin Ladin. It's fascinating meeting and encounter. So could we request you for a...
Most happily.
Thank you.
This is directly related to the question that we've discussed about the recruitment of my character, I should say, imagining how the character was actually recruited. And it pleases me a great deal that readers are saying that the strength of this book is its authenticity, that it could have happened this way. So this is the final critical meeting of this perpetrator with Osama bin Laden, and very important in terms of the oath that the perpetrator would swear to Osama bin Laden. At the door of an isolated building, Ahmed knocked twice, then knocked a single time. The door opened and I found myself in an anteroom lit only by candlelight. A group of brothers was playing backgammon. Ahmed mumbled something to one of them in Pashtun, and the guard nodded back and motioned to a side door. At this, Ahmed knocked again, and I was ushered into the presence of the sheikh. Osama bin Laden sat before me on a bank of pillows. He wore a splendid silk robe, and his white prayer cap made his beard appear larger than before. In his arms, he held a small boy, maybe 6 years old, who was obviously quite ill. The sheikh barely acknowledged my presence. He was chewing dates, and then he was putting the mush from his mouth into the mouth of the sick boy. He said my name, Abu Tariq al-Lubnani. Do you play volleyball? I was dumbfounded, speechless. He asked me again if I played volleyball. Yes, I stuttered. Volleyball is a wonderful game, he said, especially if you live in the desert. They won't let me and Atta play on the same side because we're taller than everybody else. So we have to be on opposing sides. It's become quite a rivalry. His team had lost to his cousins, he said, and they were playing again the next day, a grudge match. We're going to play at dawn, he said, at the first glimmer of light. And then he chortled, in case the Americans are watching. They're big sports fans, you know. I didn't know what to say. You are a new talent in our camp, he said. And you're tall. God willing, you will agree to join my side. Of course, I said, most happily, Ya Sayyidi. You are most welcome. On my volleyball side and on my caravan. Thank you, Ya Sayyidi. In fact, we are most pleased to welcome all 4 of you from Hamburg. You are a talented group, and I believe you will be a great credit to the organization. Your generation will be our hope. The future glory of our faith lies in your hands. We will try not to disappoint you, Ya Sayyidi. Have you met the German? Christian Zimmermann, I asked. We don't use that name, he replied. We named him Ibrahim. The sick boy, he said, was Ibrahim's son, that he had a severe kidney disease. They needed to find a way to get him to Germany for treatment, or he would die. I said, I was very sorry to hear that. Let us not grieve, he responded. If he should die, the Holy Book tells us that he will live through eternity as a lovable and much loved boy in paradise, and his father will receive an extra reward in the hereafter for his suffering on earth. We sat there in silence. Occasionally, as he kept feeding the boy in his arms, he glanced up at me and leveled me with a stare. Finally, he said, "Why have you come here tonight?" I told him I was brought at his command. "Did you come here of your own free will?" "I did," I said. And then he asked, "For what purpose?" And I said, "To swear my oath to you." But I said, "I have a question." At that, he was totally silent. I wasn't sure he had heard me. So I repeated it. "May I ask you a question about it?" He nodded. "I've heard you're very inquisitive, Abu Tariq," he said. "There is a phrase at the end, not to disobey my commanders. What is the significance of that?" "That is not complicated," he answered softly. "If I ask you to do something, you will heed and obey me. If I ask someone else to do it, you will not object. You will not ask, why did you assign that person this task? We must remember the holy text. Obey God and all those who are in authority over you." I started to interrupt, but he raised his hand for silence. "You do not like your companion, Muhammad Atta, I understand." "No, Ya Sayyidi." I had to put that feeling aside, he said, and I had to put the cause above personal likes and dislikes. But then he told me that he had named Omar as the emir of our group. "Omar, our emir," that made me very happy. And I said, "Good, wonderful." And then I caught myself. "Atta will be disappointed," I said, because I wanted him to know I understood we were a team. He kept looking at me, searching my face, and he said, "Muhammad Atta has spoken well for your group. He has said that you four came to us needing money to satisfy your duty to jihad. You expressed an interest in the Chechnya struggle. You wanted accomplices and training. He spoke to us of you personally, of your love of airplanes and flying. We welcomed his ideas and we welcome your presence. We will give you money. We will provide you brothers to help. And for you, we will train you to fly airplanes. In return, we demand loyalty and obedience." It was time for him to get the boy back to his father. "Is there anything else?" he said. "Yes," I replied, and I stood straight and I looked at him. "I pledge before God my obedience to you, Osama bin Ladin, to listen and to obey, to carry out both pleasant and unpleasant orders at good and bad times, and to work selflessly, to obey my commanders, and if necessary, to die in the cause of God." He seemed pleased, and he offered me blessings. And then he said, "I will see you tomorrow at dawn at the volleyball pitch. Your first assignment will be in the front lines as a netman. Remember what the Holy Book says. Those in the front lines of the battle will achieve the upper ranks of paradise." And then he laid the child aside and he reached for the bowl of dates across the table. "Would you like a sweet?"
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. You know, the art of the storyteller is to capture with authenticity that moment, that environment, you know, especially in distant lands and different exotic settings. And then the second part of the art is to relate it, to read it, and you've excelled in both. Thank you so much. Now, I know that there are lots of questions prepared for you, but before I let you go, Jim, I have to ask you about your next project on the Emperor Frederick II. I can't let you go without a comment on that.
Frederick II is an emperor of the 13th century who relevant to this particular discussion was a kind of Renaissance man before the Renaissance, mainly because of his embrace of world philosophy and world religion, including Islam. He became a crusader who never spilt a single drop of blood and yet captured for Christianity Jerusalem. But he was always this cosmopolitan presence, and I think I was drawn to him for this grand world vision that he presented, and I know we share a love of that character.
Amazing character, Jim. I think he should be a role model for leaders today, both in the East and the West. A man of great wisdom, learning, and a man driven by the passion to acquire knowledge. It's remarkable when you look around the world and you see some of our leaders, you really feel they would benefit from reading your new book. And I hope Chelsea makes a note that once you finish your book, you've got to get you back to Politics in Prose and request audiences to come and listen to you. Thank you so much, Jim. I'm now handing you over to Chelsea, and she's going to supervise the Q&A. Chelsea, all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, we've got quite a few. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce your name. Dean Drasnan asks, in the past, you wrote about the Jonestown Massacre. I wonder if you see parallels between that horrendous event and 9/11. Something about the impressionable nature of people to be brainwashed or radicalized?
Yes, well, thank you for that question. I think the main connection for me as a writer was equally to try to understand what could have driven people to the jungles of Guyana with Reverend Jim Jones and be so totally in his thrall that they would go to the lengths of actually committing mass suicide. Because I'm very much a product of the 1960s, very much caught up in the civil rights struggle, for example, it did fascinate me how the lore and the passion of the civil rights movement could have been so twisted by this charlatan Jim Jones, so that 1,000 people would have followed him into the jungle. So I think that's the stitch really to between Jonestown and 9/11 for me. I also had this experience in writing about the JFK assassination because I was very, very interested in the motivation for Lee Harvey Oswald and didn't really feel that the Warren Commission or the American literature generally about the JFK assassination had adequately dealt with the motivation of Lee Harvey Oswald.
All right. Let's see. Okay, John Maluski. Do you see any parallels between the radicalization of the 9/11 terrorists and the radicalization of the Americans who attacked the Capitol?
Yes. So I'm very loath to talk about radicalization because somehow if one says, well, that person has been radicalized, they have achieved a kind of a cemented state where there is no human movement one way or another. I have very studiously not used the word of radicalization for Sami Haddad, my character in the 19th Hijacker, because I think to the very end, he had qualms and he was very much in conflict about whether to go forward with the mission. One is inclined, I think, for the January 6th insurrection to think that all those people, they're put all in one basket as pro-Trump insurrectionists, all think the same way, they were all radicalized in the same way and so forth. I think when we drill down and when history drills down into January 6th, we're going to find a great disparity in motivation for that entire crowd, we'll find that there were certain ringleaders who even I would say were totally radicalized, but we're going to find that a bunch of others, like Sami Haddad possibly, were somewhat in conflict about moving into the capital. Because I've written a lot about medieval history, I have come to think of that event like the 1527 event of the sacking of Rome, that it's just a horrendous thing that our beloved capital was sacked. But when we have the ability now, unlike 1527, to really sort out those who were true criminals on January the 6th and those who were just kind of brought along.
Okay, let's see. Anonymous attendee asks, would you consider the hijackers to be mentally ill?
Well, that's truly a fascinating question. I guess not. I mean, I think there is a certain dementive logic that could actually be a normal mental process for a terrorist without labeling that person as mentally ill because of their criminal acts or their beliefs. So I think that becomes a comfortable way to categorize them all as the same thing and make it into a medical case. I happen to be the father of a handicapped child, and I have always tried to keep it somewhat a bay, just thinking of her as a medical case. So I think that becomes a convenient way to dismiss the more profound questions.
Hugh Hill says, you are a wonderful historian. If it hasn't been answered by now in the session, why fiction?
Yes, well, I think we've answered that question pretty well. That I came to this juncture with this story of whether I had to give it up because you could not tell it as a nonfiction story, or whether I would do it as a novel. And I felt that it was just such an important story historically and dramatically that I couldn't give it away. And really, so the only avenue was then to do it as fiction if I was going to do it at all.
All right. Peter J. Davis Jr. asks, Jim, have U.S. foreign military operations in the Middle East diminished or increased our security at home? Thanks.
Gosh, again, I use this excuse that I used before with Ambassador Ahmed, that I'm not a great one to look at the at these profound sociological or security questions. I'm at base a storyteller, and think that if one writes a really gripping novel, which I like to think that I have done here, that whatever lessons one might draw from this would be fine with me, and they could be contradictory lessons. So I really don't have a good answer as to whether we're more secure in any geopolitical sense.
Okay. James Irvine asks, the interplay of the woman and the German intelligence officer with the unfolding of the hijacker's tale is an effective literary method. Did you consider any alternative approaches rather than tapes to carry the tale of the hijacker?
Well, this is a novel that really has three basic characters. One is the perpetrator, one is the girlfriend, and the third one is a kind of frumpy German counterintelligence officer. There was such a person in the actual case. I was interested in the process from my experience in Army intelligence of the relationship between a subject and an intelligence officer who was trying to do something with that subject. In this case, to ferret out information about whether there would be a second wave of attack after the 9/11 attack, which was the world was apoplectic about that in the immediate aftermath. And it was the job of Kommissar Recht, is the name that I've given to this policeman, to find out whether this woman was really complicit in the attack and the conspiracy, or if she knew anything about a second wave of attacks. From my training as an intelligence officer, the worst thing that you could ever do is, as it is in the parlance, fall in love with your agent. And I rather liked that idea in evolving this tale of a rather softening of the policeman towards the girlfriend when he came to believe that she probably was not complicit in the attack itself. So I was somewhat exploring that subject of the relationship between the policeman and the subject as to whether there was an emotional relationship between the two. And in the end, there is an emotional, entirely platonic emotional relationship between Karima Ilgun and Kommissar Recht.
Anonymous attendee asks, how can we apply the lessons of Afghanistan to the evolving situation with Iran? Specifically, should we consider it futile to attempt to change their behavior? Or alternatively, do we need to be very aggressive in our approach? Thanks.
Again, these geopolitical questions somewhat stumped me. I have been to Iran. It happened to be the occasion for that was the 1998, I believe it was, Olympics, where Iran was to play the United States, the Great Satan, in the World Cup. It was not the Olympics, in the 1998 World Cup. So I had a taste in that trip about the sophistication of the Iranian people. I very much applaud the way in which the Biden administration seems to be very carefully reopening the debate and the interchange with Iran in such a way to ensure, we hope, that they would not proceed towards the building of nuclear weapons. There was a regimen in place before the Trump administration, and it seems like very, very carefully that's coming back into force. So I think that's something that we as American citizens should watch very carefully, should hope, and I believe we will find that the Biden administration is very, very sophisticated diplomatically, and that this will be a positive interchange.
Okay, I'm going to try and get to a couple more. From Saeed Khan, Professor Reston, you always infuse the nuance of psychological profiles into your wonderful books. In what danger do we in America put ourselves in failing to understand the psychology of various individuals, either by ignoring it or by reducing people to be, quote, madmen or evil? Thank you, Saeed Khan. P.S. Hello to Dr. Ahmed from Detroit.
Great. Well, I think we've covered that pretty well. I mean, we've talked about the ability, the inclination to regard people in the Middle East, particularly the criminals for this event, as monsters. And we want to guard against that attitude being applied collectively to all Arab people and all Islamic people. So profile is a problem overall for all genders and ethnic groups when they come into contact with different genders and different ethnic groups. So that's a profound question. And I think it's left to the individual themselves to make sure that they don't do that kind of profiling.
Gaines Post asks, how important was it for your story that the hijacker's girlfriend lived in Germany instead of, say, France?
Well, it was very important because so central to the whole story of 9/11 is that the conspiracy was hatched in Hamburg, Germany. And of course, in this story that I've told here, the Sami Haddad character comes from Beirut to Hamburg, Germany for higher education. But the cell itself, the Hamburg cell itself, was central to the whole narrative of the 9/11 attack. There's a lot of interest in Germany in 9/11 because of this. I'm happy to say there's some interest in German television in my novel. So that's basically it. That it just is happenstance that Hamburg was a central part of the story. But 9/11 is full of chances of history. The Flight 93 flight itself was headed for the US Capitol. It was within 20 minutes of getting to the US Capitol. If several things had not happened, we would not have had that mission against the Capitol. Number one was that Flight 93 left 20 minutes late, whereas the whole conspiracy was orchestrated that the four planes would leave at the same time and get to the target more or less at the same time. By Flight 93 leaving 25 minutes late or so was very critical to what happened, because the attacks had already happened in New York when the hijacking of Flight 93 took place over Ohio. And that meant that there were some considerable number of minutes in which cell phone calls were made by passengers to their loved ones who told them about the New York bombings and attacks. And so they came to know by virtue of that delay that their plane was part of this same conspiracy. So the delay of departure of Flight 93 was critical to what happened. The other thing that is totally a chance of history is that Flight 93, unlike the other three planes, had only 4 hijackers, 2 in the cockpit and 2 to control the passengers. And it meant that that 2 people were more easily overwhelmed than 3 would have been. And then the last chance was that it happened, that particular group of 33 Americans had within it these heroic macho people who got together in the back of the plane and decided to storm the cockpit. These are chances of history, and they could very well not have happened, and the US Capitol could very easily have been destroyed.
Okay, we just have 1 minute left, so I'm going to lump these 2 questions together. I think it'll be a brief I think it'll be quick to answer. What an amazing story. Hugh Hill is wondering if it'll be a movie, and Toby Condliff is asking, will there be an audiobook of the 19th Hijacker?
The easier question is an audio book, because it doesn't take millions upon millions of dollars to make an audio book. So I hope that that will happen. As I said, there seems to be interest in a 6-part series, I'm happy to say, about this novel by a German company, and we'll see if that happens.
We'll cross our fingers.
Me too.
Thank you both so much for joining us for such a lively and fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, our hour has come to a close. I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us as well, and gently remind you that I've placed the link to the 19th Hijacker in the chat. It will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where you can get your own copy. And while you're there, if you'll visit the events page, you can find out about other upcoming events in the near future, and we hope to see you at one of those soon. Thank you very much, both of you, so much for joining us, and stay well, everyone, and stay well read.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you so much. Congratulations, Jim. Well done. Well done. Went very well.
Thank you so much, all. Pleasure. My pleasure.